My goodness. Well, thank you for having me today. It's good to be with you and see a familiar face and my friend and colleague, Reverend Sid Fowler. And Sid, thank you for being here and acknowledge you. And as well as thank Reverend Tutt in his absence for asking me to be with you, and Elizabeth for holding things down this morning. And Amy, nice to meet you. And now, I do want to say, in their absence, thank you to Sandy Sorensen and Barbara Gerlach. They are two colleagues, friends, and mentors in ministry and mission that have some part to do in my being with you today. So I'm glad to be here. And again, thank you for your welcome as I came in this morning and listened to that beautiful music being rehearsed. Thank you, Alec, for that. That was just beautiful. Just watching you rehearse this morning was a meditative time for me, so I appreciate that. Let's just pause for just a word of prayer. God, I am grateful for this moment, and I pray that the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts would be acceptable, enlightening, and fruitful to the end of a better world, because of your Son, our elder brother, and our friend. Pray. Amen. So what a time, past 2.5 years that we have been living through, the pandemic and the environmental degradation that is becoming increasingly obvious with the extreme weather events piling up, and of course the economic reversals that we have been struggling with. And needless to say, we live in D.C. or the D.C. area. I mean, the political life of our country has just been in turmoil. And in some sense, I want to propose to you that so has our faith. This is a defining time for what it means to be Christian in this society, and therefore in a major part of the world. What is the faith of Jesus Christ really about? With white Christian nationalism on the rise, and the challenge for us to answer the questions that are being posed in the public square as to what is Christianity? Is it personal salvation? Is it personal piety, or focus on the hereafter, heaven after we die? Or is the church and state really separate, or should it be? Or is the faith synonymous with the state? Is the faith synonymous with capitalism? Is the faith synonymous with particular cultural preferences or even racial identity? The past 50 years, I want to propose to you that right-wing evangelicalism and fundamentalism have defined the public face of Christianity. When we reflexively think of Christianity, when the news media runs to find a Christian, it is usually a person on the right and a person who is defining Christianity in a way that we progressives might have some difficulty with. But we progressives have been weak in challenging Christianity in the public square. We've let it be defined as white, personal, successful, capitalist, exclusivist. And so I want to open up that question just as a visitor. So if I get in trouble, I won't come again, I guess. So I can kind of say whatever I want to say. Tim's not here today. No. But I want to engage this question with you of what is Christianity? What is the faith of Jesus Christ? And so I want to do that by looking at that second chapter of John that we read in unison together. The text of Jesus cleansing the temple is the way that text is usually thought about. Now, I didn't want to take the time, but I could have read for you the parallel text to that story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because that story actually occurs in all four Gospels in a particular way. It's the traditional, actually, Palm Sunday text. So it's actually you wouldn't have read it from John on Palm Sunday, but that text you will hear on Palm Sunday. It's the Palm Sunday parade where they come into town, and of course they lay palms down on the ground for Jesus to ride the donkey into the city. I've always wondered why they call it Palm Sunday, because palms are actually only mentioned in one version of that story, not in the others, but in each version of that story, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus comes into Jerusalem and carries out this action at the temple. Now, the thing is, we usually celebrate that as Palm Sunday, and the king is coming, and Jesus is being sort of hailed as the king, the coming king. But there's a problem with that story that I think inheres in its position in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that I think we get clarity about if we look at John. Because Matthew, Mark, and Luke all put that story of Palm Sunday, the entrance into the city of Jerusalem, Palm Sunday, the last week before crucifixion, they all put that story at the end of Jesus' ministry. They put it at the end of Matthew, at the end of Luke, toward the end of Mark, as things are beginning to come together for the crucifixion. So they see it as a culmination of Jesus' ministry. But for John, it's different. John places that story of Jesus' action in the temple area at the beginning of his story of Jesus Christ. So the book of John, it starts, first chapter in the beginning was the Word, and Word was with God. And then John sort of goes into the second chapter, and the first public appearance of Jesus is at a wedding feast. And you might remember he turns the water into wine. I mean, we could say that he gets everybody drunk. He places the best wine last, and they even comment on that. And then the third chapter, the third thing that John does, Jesus is the Word made flesh. Jesus turns the water into wine. Now, the third thing that John depicts is Jesus goes into the temple and does this temple action. So what I want to suggest is, rather than the culmination of Jesus' ministry, for the Gospel of John, they see this action as defining of Jesus' ministry. He puts it at the beginning to make the argument, this is what the rest of these stories are really about. This story that he tells us is a metaphor for what Jesus' ministry is about. It illustrates the faith of Jesus Christ, what it means for John, at least, to be Christian. So what I want to do, since we're about to enter Advent, is put this story at the beginning of our retelling of the story of Jesus. Advent is about to come, the beginning of the time when we celebrate the birth of Christ and then his mission as it unwinds in the liturgical year of the church. And so here we are, just about to go into Advent. And so I want to take John's story and position it similar to how he does in his gospel at the beginning of the telling of the story of the meaning of the faith of Jesus Christ. Now, that was a lot of ofs. Are y'all with me? Okay. So, here's the story. Jesus in Jerusalem for the Passover. Goes to the temple. Passover time, the temple is crowded with people. Roman occupiers, remember Rome occupying Palestine, so the Roman occupiers are there. They're kind of nervous because there's a lot of Jews in town, and the Jews could get out of hand if things could easily erupt as the temple courts are overcrowded. And near the temple area, in what is called the outer courts in the other stories, they're buying and selling doves and other things that they use to get admission to the inner courts of the temple. And John says Jesus marches in with his crowd. Remember, it's the Palm Sunday crowd. He marches in with the crowd, and he gets mad, makes a whip, and runs people out of the area, turning over the tables of the money changers, vandalizing the temple, disrupting the religious and financial operations, disturbing the area, making uncivil disobedience. Now, that's a shocking story, particularly if we just race 2,000 years and just imagine this story being told of someone who is to be an icon, presented as the face, the model of what we are to be in the world. John presents Jesus invoking vandalism. It's a disturbing depiction of Jesus, because usually our Jesus is normal, meek, mild, passive. I'm sure you'll remember pictures of Jesus, the one, Solomon's picture of Jesus staring impassively in the distance with a little light sort of beside his face, and the other of Jesus kneeling, looking up into a beam of light with flowing hair down his, could I just comment, that would not be what Jesus would have looked like. A Middle Eastern Palestinian 2,000 years ago would not have flowing brown hair. I've been to Palestine, I can tell you that. But the picture is Jesus kneeling, or Jesus standing passively with the staff, with a few sheep at his feet. Or even the Pietà, Michelangelo, as Jesus sprawled out on his mother's lap with the wound in his side. Or even the crucifixes, Jesus hanging on the cross. We see Jesus as still and calm and, dare I say it, impotent or weak or passive. But John gives us a different picture. This guy comes up in the temple and gets mad enough to turn things over. Not an impassive, but an active, passive. And so what I want to suggest is that we tend to domesticate Jesus because we have a cultural preference, particularly in the West, for dispassion over passion, deliberation over action, order over difference. We like quiet, not confrontation. But John's Jesus is passionate, zealous, zeal for your house. If we had read the rest of that in the second chapter of John, verse 17, it says, zeal for your house will consume me. Jesus describes himself as a zealot, willing to act, passionate. So for John, the meaning of Christianity, the faith of Jesus Christ, is passionate, strong feeling, even righteous indignation. Christianity is an activating faith, not a sedating faith. It's a stimulant, not an opiate. It's fear, not necessarily nice. So Jesus here in John's story is illustrating a confrontational faith that when necessary defies the nation and the religion, far from a religion of the state. Jesus' faith is a religion against the state, far from accommodating the cultural arrangements. Jesus, in John's vision, beginning of his ministry, defined as interrupting the arrangement, the religion, and the commerce, objecting to the status quo. Now, I do want to be clear about why I say this more particularly, because for us, distant 2,000 years and many cultural traditions away from where this story would have been best understood, you want to ask the question, well, why was Jesus doing this? Why did he go into the temple and start turning things over? Why would this story have emerged? Why would they tell this story about it? So what I want to offer to you is to understand that the temple in Jesus' day was a microcosm of Jesus' society. It was the place where the intersection of state and religious and cultural power came together. It was the site of the collaboration between the state and the faith. The Roman occupiers allowed the temple to act, allowed the temple to carry out its activity, as long as the temple gave Rome its cut. gave Rome its share. Remember that story where they came to Jesus and say, this coin, what is it? Who does this belong to? And Jesus takes the coin. Do you also remember that? And says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God. That was the arrangement. The arrangement was Caesar gets his share. And as long as Caesar gets his share, y'all can carry on and do what you want. So the temple was the site of the power of the state and the power of the faith to manage and control the people. The temple courts were a vast area. If you've been to Israel, I was fortunate enough to be there a couple years ago. The Temple Mount is vast. I mean, several football fields in size was the temple area, and the courts were divided into sections. And the inner court was nearest the small, what to us would be smallish temple, which would be, the temple would have been smaller than this space, the actual temple itself, but the vast temple area was massive, and they would divide it up. The inner court would be the court that they called the inner court, was the court for the men. That's where the Torah was read, and only men were allowed in that court. But only men of means, only men who could afford the turtle dove, the lamb, the sheep, that they were buying just outside to go into the temple. So the inner courts were for the men of means. The court of the women was next to the inner court. And that would have been the area where the women sat. And if you go now into Orthodox synagogues, you can see the separation where the women sit separate apart from the men. And so the next area was for Jewish women whose men were able to be in the inner courts, and those women would be in the outer court, in the court of the women. But then next to the court of the women was the vast outer court of the temple. And that's where all of the hangers-on and the people that wanted to understand maybe what Judaism meant, they might have wanted to hear the Torah. They were called God-fearers. They were interested. It'd be like people that come in your Bible study and sit in the back of the church. They're sort of interested in what you might say about the Bible, but they're not really necessarily believers. So the outer court was for the poor people who couldn't afford the price of admission to the inner court. Those are the people who were unclean. They were the outsider. So that was the outer court of the temple. And they could sometimes snatch a word or two that would have been heard from the reading of the Torah, but they were pretty far away. But now this is the area, the outer court, is where they had set up the market. So they set the market up so that the people who could afford entrance into the temple could buy whatever they needed, the goat, the lamb, whatever, to take it in to the temple to give to the priests in order to sustain the operations of the temple. The market took the space that was for the underprivileged. The market took the space away that was for the people who, for one reason or another, unclean, female, poor, non-Jewish, goyim, Gentile, the people who couldn't get in to the inner courts could stand near the outer court and just try to hear a little bit of the reading. But that area was taken away for the convenience of the people with means. So when Jesus comes in, he clears this area out. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke say that what he says is, you have taken the house of prayer for all peoples. Remember that thing? Goyim, unclean, all the people who weren't admitted to the temple. Jesus says, you've taken the area that's for all people, and you've turned it into a den of robbers. So Jesus is passionate, gets angry, turns over table in the service of justice, in the service of the outsider, in the service of increasing access to God for those who were excluded. John's story of Jesus starts with Jesus taking action, disturbing the peace to make room for people who were traditionally excluded. Risking himself, risking his reputation, risking order, ultimately even risking his life to increase fairness, access, and justice. So, what is the faith of Jesus Christ? What is Christianity? We're in a big argument about that today is my proposal. My brief response is the faith of Jesus Christ is passion and willingness to disturb the established order for the purpose of increasing access and justice for all people. So here we are in our own temple. If DC, y'all, is kind of like the temple. It is the site of the intersection of all the powers. They are here just down Mass Avenue. You keep going straight. It's the site of power. So here we are in our own temple of sorts. In the place where the church and the state are learning how to collaborate, control, exclude, and dominate. Inequality is an evidence all around us. But we're Christian, or so we say. So what does that mean for us today? What is our faith in Jesus Christ going to look like? Personal piety, cultural preference, national allegiance? Or is it John's argument? Action, passion, confrontation, risk-taking in the pursuit of more justice, more inclusion, more access, more equality. Our challenge, my challenge to you, my challenge to me, is to live the answer to that question. May we have the courage to embody not the Jesus on his knees staring away, but the Jesus of the temple with feeling, taking action to make more things